evening, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. It's True Crime with Jess Rose. I'm here every Tuesday and Thursday at 8 p.m. Tuesdays are my request evening. Thursdays stories that I like to bring to you. I'm also over on the TikTok, which is Jess Rose 5472. Or you could join my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Jess Rose 5472. Or you could just like, you could comment, you could subscribe, or just watch. You could just watch, and that's just as good. So now that I've got all that out of the way, I'm going to start tonight's story. Quick warning, it is a child. It's horrific, as they always are. Oh, God. But yes, so now I'm going to start. So this one is, as the title says, House Full of Monsters, the upsetting Christopher Barrios Jr. story. Okay. So we have Christopher Michael Barrios Jr., born on the 2nd of January 2001 in Brunswick, Georgia. It is an American story. Christopher has had 6 brothers, 2 sisters, quite a big family. I don't believe they were all together at all. Not a lot said about them. I have got names. They're not mentioned in any of this, so I won't give their names. And yeah, I'm not too sure. There's a couple of different surnames, so I don't believe, I don't know how many were living with little Christopher at the time, so I'm not going to really get into that too much. Now, his mum is Latrina Keith, his dad Mike Barrios, but I believe his dad was Christopher Michael Barrios Sr., but they call him Mike, okay, and I'm going to call him Mike for the story, all right? So Christopher himself, absolutely beautiful little boy, gorgeous little boy. And I say every time, and then I say this every time, and then I say that every time, but have a look at him. It's just adorable little fella. Quite shy, it said, quite a quiet little lad. Beautiful smile. He was, like I say, he was quite shy, quite reserved, he's scared of the dark, bless him. But what he'd love to do, he loved superheroes, and he used to put a towel over his shoulders and run round with this towel flailing behind him like he was his own. He was the superhero. You know, he loved computer games. I believe it was Ben 10 was his favourite. And Spider-Man was his favourite superhero as well. Okay, so just a little bit about Christopher himself. He loved cats. It said, absolutely love cats. Not too fond of dogs. I think he was quite scared of bigger dogs. But he loved cats, and he had a pet stray cat who he'd nicknamed, or well, not nicknamed, he called him Jimmy. So just such a sweet little boy. Really, really sweet little boy. He loved his family. He loved his little friends that he had at school. He was just adorable. Loved his little bike. He used to grind on his little bike. So cute. Now, we're coming up to March 2007, and at this point, Christopher's 6, okay, at this point of the story. Now, Latrina herself, his mom, she was in jail at that point. So Christopher was actually living with his dad and the dad's girlfriend. I believe her name's Paula. Now, I've only seen that on one source, and it was only on a picture, on some sort of writing. So I believe that's the girlfriend's name, but I'll say allegedly, okay? But I believe it was. I don't see why that would have been written otherwise. But so he moves in with his dad and his dad's girlfriend in Brunswick. Now, Brunswick itself is a safe town, apparently, very safe, small, close-knit community. Everyone knows everyone. Kids go out and play from quite a young age. You know, it's one of those places, it would seem, from what I've heard about it, that you'd be quite happy to let your kids go out and play, and, you know, have a chat to your neighbours and know what so-and-so is doing, you know, down the road. It was one of those places. It looks very pretty. It looks very nice. Now they were living at Canal Mobile Home Park on Horseshoe Lane. Okay, so it is a like it says, trailer park or mobile home park. Um, and that's where Christopher's living with his dad and the dad's girlfriend. Also, less than a minute away, a lot on the same road in the same mobile park, um, his nan and granddad live. Okay, now the nan and granddad is Sue and Luis Rodriguez. Rodriguez, I never pronounce that right. It's terrible. Now I have read somewhere else that the granddad's name was Jose, but I've found on two other sources that his name was Luis. So I'm going with Luis, okay? There was also an uncle of Christopher's who lived on that mobile home park, his uncle Frank. So he had a lot of family around him. This boy was very loved. And what he'd do, he was a creature of habit. Little Christopher was. He liked structure. He liked order to his day. So he'd come home from school. Apparently, he'd get on the bus to come home from school. You know those school buses they have in America. We don't tend to have them as much here. And it would drop him off just at the end of Horseshoe Lane, apparently. And he would head straight to his nan's, which is obviously Sue, as I mentioned. And he'd go there for dinner after school. Then he'd go out to play, and then he'd go home, always before dark. Now, when I say go home, these houses, as I've mentioned, were only a minute apart. So, you know, the neighbours all knew him. It was, you know, there was a little swing set, literally 2 seconds from his house. It was, so I know he's only 6, and you might be like, why is he out playing at 6? But don't forget, this isn't the same as the big cities, whether that be in England or America. It's not like the big built up cities where you probably wouldn't let your child out, especially at 6, to play on their own. You know, this is a very safe little town, and there'll be lots of kids out. So, you know, this was his habit. This is what he used to do. All right. And as I've said, he was absolutely loved by everyone. Adorable, adorable little boy. Now we get to Thursday, the 8th of March, 2007. And as I've said, Christopher is age 6, all right, at this point. Now it's a normal day, you know, nothing out of the ordinary. Christopher goes to school as normal. He gets off the bus apparently at about 2:45 p.m. And he goes to his nan's as usual. She gives him a hug as he comes in, and he sits down to play his Ben 10 game on his little computer. And Sue does his dinner. All right. Now, after dinner, it says that he nips home to grab a lightsaber that his dad had recently bought him. And then he goes out to play, and says that about 6:15, because the night would have been drawing in by that point, he would have headed home. Now, when I say headed home, he's in the vicinity. He's not far. It was said that he wouldn't have dreamt of going far. Like I say, very careful little boy, and quite a nervous little child. So he wouldn't have ventured any further than his nan's and his dad's house. And like I say, his uncle lives on the same, I wouldn't say estate then, but I suppose it is like an estate, but it's the mobile home park. But it gets to 7:15, and Mike's girlfriend calls him at work to say that Christopher hadn't come back. Now, the reason she'd waited, you know, a bit longer was she thought he was at Sue's. And Sue, obviously, because he'd left after dinner, she just presumed he would have been at home at that time. So when they realised he wasn't with either one of them, they started looking around, and, you know, where he'd normally be by the swings, and just, you know, just up and down the road. When I say road, it's very thin, you know, and the mobile homes they're not built up. There's like little spaces between them. But they had a quick nose round, couldn't see him, phoned Mike. Mike rushes home and he starts looking around. He speaks to Frank, who's obviously the uncle, and no one's seen him. No one's seen him from earlier on that afternoon, since earlier on that afternoon. Okay. So when he looks around, like you say, he's gone around the trailer park, he's asked some kids, and some kids do say they saw little Christopher on the swings at about 5:30, but he wasn't seen again. And no one had seen him since then. All right. So Mike calls 911 at about 8:30. All right. Christopher would never have gone further than the swings. That's what Mike knew. And he knew something was really bad. Something was wrong. So the police quickly begin a search. You know, this is a young boy, it's a young child, and they start a search, or straight away. And this goes on through the night, but not just the police or the community come out. Apparently, it was about 300 people searching everywhere. Quite near the mobile home park, there was like a canal that ran down by a wooded area. They searched down there, but Mike knew, he was like, he would never in a million years have gone down there. He was scared of the dark. He wouldn't have been down there. So Mike knew there was something really wrong here. But they're searching, everyone's hanging on to hope that they're going to find this little boy. Okay, so, but the following morning comes, into the 9th of March 2007, so this is the Friday. And people are up and they're out again, looking, surrounding. Now, Mike and Sue are obviously terrified. His whole family are. I'm just mentioning them because they're mentioned a lot more during this case, but his whole family are just, that you can't, after a whole night, you're going to be, your brain's going to be going to real negative thoughts, isn't it? I just can't imagine. I can't imagine how they must have been feeling. Now, by this point, the FBI joined the search, the National Guard joined the search. This is a real big case. It had went from just local, now it's regional. Everyone's getting involved. There's helicopters with heat-seeking equipment trying to just, go over the wooded area. Maybe he'd gone there for some reason, even though Mike knew he wouldn't have. Maybe for some reason he has, and he's hurt himself. They were trying everything to find this little boy. Now, everyone in the neighbourhood was involved. Everyone was out looking. Everyone wanted to find. Everyone was heartbroken trying to find this little boy, except one family. And that family was David and Peggy Edenfield, along with their son, George. All right. So I'm just going to mention those quickly. Now we get to the 10th of March 2007. We know it's Saturday. All right. And the police by this point are saying this is no longer a missing child. They're now treating it as an abduction. Okay. It's been too long. The searches haven't brought up anything. But what they found that day was round the back of the Edenfields, who I just mentioned, they found a lightsaber, a child's lightsaber. What was Christopher playing with that evening? So it's well, what was that in your garden? It's a bit questionable, isn't it? But because the gardens are open, they're not enclosed. It's all sort of, you imagine a trailer, a mobile home. We've got static caravans. It's all sort of open, isn't it? So it was open. He could have been running through. It didn't actually mean too much at that point, but it was like, why is that there? And the reason the police were more inclined to be a bit suspicious of this is the police knew. They knew the family very well. The Edenfields, who were actually keeping their heads down at this point, okay? Now, David Edenfield, who is dad, all right, he's an older guy, and at this point, I believe he'd have been about 57, okay? He'd actually been charged back in 1994 for incest with his daughter. Okay. He'd actually pled guilty and received 10 years probation. Now, what I'd heard while researching this case is that apparently David had run his house with a rod of iron, or like a rod of iron. Is it right? With a rod of iron. It was said he was a very bad-tempered man. Now, when you look at him, if you go away and look at him, he looks just like an old man, just a, friendly old man. But apparently, looks are deceiving. We know that. And it said that when his daughter and his son, who I mentioned, George, were younger, he would beat them with like 2x4s, planks of wood. He'd molested the two of them. And then it had gone on to be an incest case once his daughter had got older. That's all I can presume from it, because the information's a little bit sketchy on it. But he pled guilty to this charge back in 94, and he'd received 10 years probation for committing incest with his daughter. I was a bit like, okay, right. Now, George Edenfield, the son, all right. Now, stop before you feel too bad for him. When I'd mentioned, obviously, he'd been beaten by his dad and perhaps molested by his dad. All right. So, you might feel sympathetic. Okay, that's fine. But George himself, he'd been arrested and charged with 2 counts of molesting 2 boys by rubbing sexually over them with his clothes. Sexually against them over his clothes and over their clothes. Just weird. Now, he'd received probation in May of 97. All right. But in September 06, he had violated his probation. He was living with David and Peggy, mum and dad. And the probation that he was on had meant that he couldn't be within, I believe it's 300 metres, which is 1,000 feet of schools and parks and places where children will be. That was his probation, and he violated that where he was living. So the whole family had to move. And in around September, October of 06, okay, they'd all moved to the, oh goodness me, let me remember the name of it, Canal Mobile Home Park, which is where Mike and his girlfriend and his son Christopher are living. All right. They all moved there, and you might be like, there's a lot of kids there. The loophole was the original probation grounds, or rules, should I say, were not to be by schools and parks. But originally on there was bus stops, okay? And a law came in earlier on in the 2006 that they couldn't include bus stops in it. It was going against your civil rights, I believe, or going against his civil rights. So they took buses off that list. And what's by this mobile park? The bus stop, okay, where the school bus drops kids, on the mobile home park where there are a lot of children. It was very sketchy how we got away with being there. It really is. Okay. So they'd moved onto that mobile home park law, because that was about 6 months previous. Now, because he'd violated his probation, even though he'd moved, he'd been given another 10 years probation on the 5th of March 2007, which was exactly 3 days before Christopher went missing. Okay. Now, I believe probation, if you're given that and you violate it, then you have to complete the rest of that sentence in jail. That's my understanding of it. Why was that probation extended, and so he could go out and just live his life. I don't understand that. He violated the terms. Why was he allowed to remain out in the community? I don't understand. Okay, so that's the family, all right, and that's how why the police are aware of this family, all right. So during this that evening, a community vigil is held. I never pronounced that right. Where all the community get together and they, they've all got candles and they're all just hoping for the safe return of Christopher. And utterly heartbreaking, again, quite notably missing from this vigil is the Edenfields. Now, police said that they would see them looking through, their curtains, and kind of they could tell they were looking, but they never came out of their door. It was all very shifty. Now you could think, wow, they've got previous, maybe they want to stay away in case they do get accused. There's an argument for that, but the police aren't too sure. Okay, so like I say, the community had always been wary of the Edenfields. Now, it's not because they knew of their previous charges, which they didn't. The parents of the children around there, they didn't know anything about their history, but it was the way they were. They would see David, who's the dad, and George, who's the son, who at that point was about 31, just looking at the kids, not even slowly. They'd be outside staring at the kids as they walked past. And one of those kids was Christopher. Okay. So it would make people uncomfortable, very uncomfortable, to the point where Sue and Mike, Christopher's nan and dad, had actually warned him to stay away from them. All, like I say, all the kids had been warned, but told, they're not good people, stay away. Until a few days beforehand, Christopher had come into his nan and said, "George is nice, Grandma." And it says that Sue just got, the fear of God run through her as she heard her grandson say those words. And she was like, what are you talking about? And she was like, "He's nice. He plays computer games too." And Sue warns him again. She's mortified, and she warns him again, "You stay away from that family and you stay away from that man. They're not nice people." He's 6 years old. How much can you tell a 6-year-old? Especially when you're not aware of their history either. You're just basing it on a feeling, and your grandson's coming to you and going, "No, actually, they're really nice." And you're having to warn against it, but purely based on your own feeling of them. It must have been, it just must have been quite awkward, really, to try and have that conversation with him, but not be able to explain why. It's just a feeling you've got, but everyone had that feeling. They all thought they were weird. Okay, so now a witness had come forward by this point to say she had seen Christopher outside on that evening talking to George. Okay, and on the day he'd been missing, on the day he'd gone missing. So this is what they needed. They've got this witness now they can place George with Christopher through this witness. So they bring him in for questioning. All right. And he's a bit shifty at first, George is. Don't forget, George is the son. He's a bit shifty at first. And then all of a sudden he says, "Christopher's dead." And that the devil spoke to him and says he had to kill him. And when the police continued talking to him, he says he'd watched him get off the school bus, when we know he'd got off the bus at 2:45. And then he'd seen him later on his way back home. Now remember, Christopher wouldn't have stayed out, gone dark. Everyone knew that. So it was on his way back to his house from the swings that George says he'd seen him. And he invited him in to play video games. What was Christopher's love? What's every 6-year-old kids love at at that age. Video games, it's exciting to them. He already believed this man was nice. And he said he invited him in. He says, and then he molested him and he killed him. This is what George says. Okay. But however, he kept changing. He kept changing his story. One minute Christopher was dead, then he was saying he was alive. He wouldn't tell the police where Christopher was. He was being a bit of a nightmare. Okay. But the police were now convinced that this had gone from a missing child to an abduction to now a murder investigation. They were convinced of that by this point, okay? So George was now arrested, all right? But what they did, they arrested him for violating his probation, all right? And the violation was living too close to kids, okay? So the police hadn't noticed that, but they were like, well, you would have known. You would have known you were too close to the kids. So they arrested him so they can keep him in while they're investigating, okay, and gaining evidence as to what has happened, all right? So around this time, there's a methane gas check being done on these mobile homes, and they go to the Edenfields, this team does, and when they're doing this methane gas check, it just oh god, my brain's gone stuck. The not awareness, oh god, there's a word and I can't think of it. The appearance of methane was showing up. I know that's not the right word, but it was showing up at their address, okay, quite strongly. Now, methane is a gas that's given off when there's a dead body. That's the gas that's given off. And it was flagging up. I think that's what I meant to say, flagging up. So at this point then, the gas company get in touch with the police, and the police come in and they arrest Peggy now, okay? So they want to speak to Peggy, and then they bring in, they question Peggy, and they bring in David. Okay, so now they've got the 3 family members. George is actually been arrested completely over probation charges, and they've now got Peggy and David, okay, that they're questioning, mum and dad, all right? So she comes up with quite a few stories. Now, this is going to get confusing because I was confused researching this, okay? I'm trying to make it as to the date and as clear as possible, but she really messed the police about. She genuinely did. Her first story was, I saw Christopher in Georgie's room playing a computer game. I knew that he shouldn't have a child in his room, so I took Christopher by the hand and I walked him home. That was story 1. Story 2 was, yes, I saw Christopher playing a computer game in Georgie's bedroom. I knew he shouldn't have been there, but George has got the mind of a 5-year-old. So I thought he'd be okay. So I allowed Christopher to stay and play computer games as long as the bedroom door was left open. Okay, this is George's bedroom. This is a man in his 30s, his bedroom, okay, and a 6-year-old little boy, okay? And she was like, leave the door open, all right? So then her next story is, right, okay, I did see him in his room. I didn't walk him home. I didn't say leave the door open. What it was is I saw him in there. I kind of let him stay, but when I came back, George was molesting him, and then he strangled him. This woman, this is the third story she's given to police in a very short time period, okay? And then she comes out, still sticking with that story, but she goes, and David's involved. who's George's dad, her husband. Okay. Her third, I think we're on the fifth story now. She's now saying that, yes, George killed him. David was there and was also involved, but there was also another man called Donald Dale, okay, who was a friend of the family and a neighbour, all right? Now, Donald Dale is actually, he's mentally challenged, okay? He does have a mental disability, all right? And she says that it was Donald Dale, George and David, so dad, son, and their family friend, who then, after Christopher was strangled, put him into a black plastic bag, a plastic bin bag, and dumped his body. It's a 6-year-old little boy they're talking about. She's talking about, should I say. So David's now arrested at this point, and Donald. All right. Now, on the 15th of March 2007, because none of these people, even after all of what they were saying, would say where this little boy was to give the family peace. They wouldn't. And the police at this point must have still been so confused, because they're like, they're only telling us half truths. What, we don't know what the truth is. But as I said, on the 15th of March 2007, where little Christopher had been missing for a week at this point, in Brunswick Airport, which is, it's not far, it's about a mile away from the mobile home park. It's surrounded by woods, and Christopher was found by National Guard that was searching as the police were. They were all still, obviously the search was still going on. And some black bags about, it says that not far in from the roadside were spotted. And when they got closer, the smell was unmistakable. They knew what that smell was. And it said that when you smell the smell of decomposition of a body once, you never forget it. That's what I've heard. So when they got closer to these black bin bags and the smell hit them, they knew what that was. And when they opened the bag, it revealed the naked body of little Christopher. Just absolutely awful. Now, it had been a week, and by this point, he was decomposed. He was. And Mike, his dad, had to go. He didn't have to go. He wanted to. He wanted to go and see his son one more time, and he would have ID'd his body. Okay? But what was the truth? What happened? What on earth happened to little Christopher Barrios Jr.? Okay? We still don't know. Now, David, he begins to talk. He does begin to talk, okay? And while he's talking, the autopsy's done on little Christopher. And it is similar to what they described, what George had said and what Peggy had said, okay? He had died of asphyxiation, all right? His manner of death, that was his cause of death, and his manner of death is a homicide. He also had severe injuries to his throat, his legs, and his genitals. There was bite marks on his back. It's also said on his behind and his genitals, human adult bite marks. Just absolutely horrific. On the 21st of March 2007, his little funeral's held. You know, the funeral is just, it was just covered with flowers and Spider-Man figures and toys for him. His little bike was, the bike that he loved, was put next to his coffin. He had a fire department honour guard that showed up as well. There was over like 800 people there for this little boy. You know, the family were devastated. Said the granddad, Luis, that I mentioned earlier, was sat there, apparently in silence, walking stick on his lap, just head down, crying. Mike, Latrina. So they were all just devastated, absolutely devastated. Just couldn't believe that this had happened in such a safe place. He should have been safe. Just absolutely awful. So now we've got four people that have been arrested, you know, for the murder of this little boy. And as I've mentioned, it was, if I tell you their names again, it is David and Peggy Edenfield, their son George, and their friend Donald Dale. I believe his name is Donald Dale. Have I said that right? Yes, Donald Dale. Okay, so now we get to. Sorry. Oh, it's just awful, isn't it? It's just absolutely horrific that this little boy was just out playing. Where he lived, he hadn't gone off, he hadn't gone to a park somewhere. He was literally a stone's throw from not only his house, his nan's house. Absolutely awful. Okay. So they're all charged, and then the trials begin to go ahead. Okay. So Dale himself, Donald Dale, should I say, he agreed to plead guilty to just providing false statements, this guy did, because he was actually developmentally delayed. Now, was this why he was friends with George, who I've mentioned? They're also saying, you know, his mum says he's got the you know, the brain of a 5-year-old. You know, is this why they were friends? I don't know. But he was actually, he said he would plead guilty to providing false statements because he had an alibi. His boss said he was with him. He was with him the entire day. He hadn't done anything. They just roped him in. Okay. Now he'd been in October 2007. He'd actually been in jail by this point for about 13 months. So the judge gave him another 3 months and then gave him 3 years suspended sentence. And he had to go to a facility for people with developmental delays. It said that he was manipulated by the Edenfields. This guy really, he helped bring Christopher's body to the airport and the woods where he was found. But it was said he wouldn't have understood. That's what they've said. Okay, now I don't know. That was what was agreed, and that's his terms he was given. That was his sentence he was given, and that's what's said. Okay, so then we get to David. Okay, David Edenfield, Daddy, and at this point, Daddy's 61, and he looks every year of it in that trial. If you saw him and you didn't know, you would honestly just think he looked like a friendly old man. You really would. You wouldn't really bat an eyelid. Okay, you wouldn't. All right. So David himself, he'd actually confessed. David had. He'd actually confessed to what he'd done. All right, but which was recorded. Now, Peggy, Mum, I am going to explain all this now. I just want to tie it all up. Peggy, Mummy dearest, she was like, she knew she was going to get, also, if they're going for death on this, they're going for the death sentence for all 3 family members, Mummy, Daddy, and son. They're going for death sentence on all of them. All right. So Peggy's like, well, listen, if you don't do that, I'll plead guilty, and I'll testify. I'll testify against my husband and my son. So she just folded straight away. She did. She was like, look, that's what I'll do. So at David's trial, that's what she did. It's exactly what Peggy did. Okay. And this is what happened to little Christopher. Yeah. And this is what David had told the police too. All right. So George had invited little Christopher in to play on computer games. That had happened. All right. And apparently Peggy had seen little Christopher in the room with George. But there wasn't a concern. There wasn't like, oh my God, my son's got previous. Get this child out of the house. No. What happened is David walked in to the room, saw his wife Peggy stood there and was watching as George was stripping off little 6-year-old Christopher. Well, Christopher was saying, no, please don't do this. Stop. Please don't do this. A 6-year-old little boy. Okay? And so David holds down little Christopher while George sodomizes him. And then George holds down Christopher while David sodomizes him. And they abuse this child. They make him give oral sex. They bite him, as we know. And they do this for the next 2 hours. And all the while, he's begging them to stop. But what he's also saying is that he's going to tell his nan. And he's going to tell his dad. And I just think, how strong. He was defiant. He was like, look, I am telling them what you're doing to me. But then George says, George is the son, said, well, we're going to have to kill him. Now, this is what Peggy and David said. Was it his idea? No, who knows? Who knows? But they decided that Christopher had to die because he was going to tell his nan and his dad what these 2 grown men had been doing to him over 2 hours. And you might be like, well, what was Peggy doing though? What was Peggy doing while her son and her husband were doing this to a little boy? Well, it said that she was pleasuring herself while this was going on in the same room. He must have just, he must have looked at these 2 men, but then saw this woman who would have looked, I'm hazarding a guess here, around the same age as his nan. And he must have thought, maybe she'll help me. And instead she decided to pleasure herself while this was going on. This is why I called this House Full of Monsters. This is why I called it that. And as I said, George has decided that they've got to kill him. So he begins choking little Christopher. And David says that he then went up, and Peggy testifies to this too, says that he went over and put his hands over George's, which were over Christopher's neck, and he squeezed too. So it's actually the 2 of them. It was the weight of 2 grown men strangling this little boy. And he was begging them to stop until he couldn't speak anymore, until they killed him. And then George went out and he grabbed some soap and water and started washing little Christopher's neck once he was killed, try and get rid of his fingerprints from around his neck. And then they put him into black bags. And then they get Donald Dale. And they say that they need to get rid of. I don't know if he knew if Christopher was in those bags. I don't know. But he helps them to get rid of Christopher. Oh, God, just absolutely rotten. So it only took, this was in September 2009, this was David's trial. It only took 2 hours for the jury to find him guilty. And then, because it was a death penalty, because it was a death penalty trial, they then had to go out to discuss his sentence. And it only took them another 2 hours to come back in. And he was given death. Okay, not only was he given death, he was given plus a life sentence plus 40 years. You know what America's like, if they're going to throw it at you, they'll throw like thousands of years at you. So he's given death and then he's given a life sentence and 40 years on top of it. They throw everything at him. He did try and appeal this, but right up until 2022, that had been upheld. So he's still on death row now. He's still on death row now, and this is 16 years later. Okay. Now, Peggy, she, for testifying in September of 2011, she was given 60 years. Okay. And then George was deemed mentally incompetent. Okay. And he was ordered to a state mental hospital. Now, it said he probably won't ever get out. It said, but they also say he probably won't do any prison time, but he should remain in that mental hospital. But Sue, Christopher's grandmother, once this had been passed, she actually says he ain't crazy, he's smart as a whip. He's got them all fooled. That's what she says, okay? Now I don't know. He had a lot of assessments during, the trial, as you can tell by the date. It took a while to get all the evidence together. There was a lot of assessments that were done. So even assessments done on Peggy and David. So it all took time, and he was assessed, and that's what they came up to, is just said that he was mentally incompetent to stand trial. He didn't understand the process. He didn't get it. That's what they're trying to say. Now, if he has got them all fooled and somehow he manages to get out of that mental facility and doesn't end up going into prison, then I don't know. I don't know how. I don't think that could happen. But my God, if he does. Now, Latrina, obviously, Christopher's mom, she filed an unlawful death lawsuit against the owner of the mobile home park, okay, because they'd known the Edenfields history when they allowed them to move in. Don't forget, they'd only moved in 6 months previous. And she'd known the history. And she allowed them to move in, okay? There was also a lawsuit put against DCFS, the Department of Child and Family Services, for placing Christopher with his dad, Mike. Now, she was in jail at the time, which is all I've seen everywhere. I don't know why. Unless there's something more behind that I haven't been able to find. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't his fault that happened. It wasn't his fault. How would he know? So now we've also got in October of 2008, right? This I find just mind-blowing. There was a show called General Hospital that was shown on the ABC network. And there was a picture of little Christopher. One of his pictures was used in the background of a particular scene. It came up on the computer in a scene. Now, it wasn't based on what had happened to Christopher or anything about Christopher. It was just a picture of his that had been put up as part of this TV show. Oh, could you imagine? Could you imagine how that family felt? That if they weren't watching it, someone was, and they found out. And oh, just absolutely awful. They were also, I believe, I'm going to say allegedly, they settled paying the family $75,000. I'm just going to say alleged on that. Again, it's very sketchy. I don't know if it was settled out of court. I don't know what's happened with that, but that's what they were sued for doing that. Now, they did issue an apology and they did launch an investigation as to how did this photograph turn up on their desks to use in a scene on the show. But it says that they went ahead and sued them for it. Now, Mike himself, he's actually says that him and his mum, Sue, will be present at David's execution, whenever that may be. He says, as long as I'm alive, I will be there. The only thing he was disappointed in is that all three weren't put on death row. That's the only thing he said he would have wanted. You know, when the deal was done with Peggy to testify against her son, which she didn't end up having to do, and her husband, he didn't agree with that at all. You know, he said Christopher wouldn't have wanted him, you know, dealing with these people, you know, making a deal with these people. But I don't know. I mean, David did confess, and his confession was very similar to what Peggy had said. But maybe they just didn't think that was enough. Maybe could recant it. Maybe the defence would have fought against it. Maybe they needed her for both of them. I don't know. They made the deal, but 60 years, she's never getting out alive. I mean, she looks a fair age as it is. She was the only one I couldn't quite find an age on. But if David's 61, she's not far behind, right? And obviously that was back in 2009. So David now will be, what, 77? 77? So, you know, I'm presuming he's going to die before he actually gets sentenced to death, unfortunately. Depending on how he dies, it could die quite painfully. Who knows? We can hope. But absolutely awful. And there was another thing I found out was that after they'd killed little Christopher, murdered him, after they put him through 2 hours of I would class torture, it was said that, I think David said it and Peggy said it, they said while he was lying there, they all got very excited while he was lying there dead. And they pleasured themselves. Well, she pleasured herself again. And they pleasured themselves. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say about this family. I genuinely don't. And like I say, little Christopher, upon looking at them, he was 6 years old. He would never have, you know, everyone in his life were people who loved him. He would never have known that there was people like this walking the earth. And how would you even convey that to a 6-year-old anyway? Like I say, he'd been told by his nan and his dad to stay away from them, but he wouldn't have known why. And oh, it's just such a shame. And the fact that he was begging them to stop, just utterly heartbreaking. And we know that through Peggy's testimony, that's what was happening. Oh, just an awful, awful, awful case. Oh, that was House Full of Monsters, the upsetting Christopher Barrios Jr. story. Just such a shame. Sorry there was a bit of chopping and changing during the story. there was just so much information where they'd confessed and then retracted it and then come up with something else and then retracted it. And, you know, they all messed about. They all messed the police about. Terrible. There was so many different, you know, scenarios that they come up with. So it was a bit of chopping and changing. I do apologise for that. But yeah, just an awful, awful story. Thank you so much for joining me. I really do appreciate it. I genuinely do. Like I say, I'm here every Tuesday and Thursday at 8 p.m. if you'd like to join me. Or if you'd like to subscribe, that'd be great. But other than that, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining me. I really do appreciate it. And I'll see you on Thursday. Thank you again. Take care. Thank you.